Doing that. Oh, look at that. So thank you for attending today. As I said, the session is recorded. We have live transcript turned on. So before we get into it, I also want folks to know that we have the chat feature turned on. We had actually preferred to not have it on, but due to the ability to pay for the Q&A, we ask that folks, we understand that these kind of events can lead to sharing certain experiences in the chat. We want you to be mindful around that, especially because this is a mixed crowd. If you start sharing your story, the very person you could be talking about might be in the space. Not to say that's wrong. Some people have really messed up experiences with lawyers, child protection workers, those within child welfare that are legitimate and, should be heard, but we want folks to be mindful. So the other thing is, if you have questions, we're going to have a question period at the end. And with that, my colleague Ashley Ash is going to send the questions to our moderator. So she'll be looking at the chat throughout the evening if you want to put them in the chat. We might not have time to get to everyone's question because there were exactly 300 people who registered for this. So I'm sure folks are going to have questions and we might not always be able to provide answers, but hopefully we can. So with that, the other thing being, obviously we said start time is 7 o'clock. Start time is 6 o'clock, end time is 7. Here we are at 6:12, so we're probably going to go a bit over, but we're still going to be mindful of time. And with that being said, I'm going to begin. So first, I want to begin with reminding everyone of the spaces we take up, the history and the history's responsibilities and commitments that flow from where we are located as individuals and communities. I myself currently take up space in Toronto, the land of the Anishinaabe, Mississaugas, and Haudenosaunee. Toronto is governed by the Dish with One Spoon Treaty, a treaty between these nations and people which direct them, and now all of us, to share and protect this land under fundamental principles of peace, friendship, and respect. I choose not to use the language of traditional territory because I want to remind us that Indigenous peoples to Turtle Island are still here, as is their land, and the state actively seeks to continue its settler colonial genocidal project through many means, one of which is the significant role child welfare plays. I also want to recognize that some of us arrive in colonial name Canada in ways that don't fit within the term settler, such as those from the African diaspora who exist here as a stolen people on stolen land, while also being always unsettled from the spaces we are forcibly brought or flee to. I want to recognize that other peoples and communities arrive at this land through ongoing histories of violence, such as settler colonialism, imperialism, and white supremacy. Therefore, we have a collective responsibility not only to the treaties of this land, but also to the various ongoing histories of dispossession and genocide occurring throughout the world. Now, to contextualize this public talk, abolition and child welfare, I want to begin with who and what the collective child welfare survivors is. At the time, November of 2018, the Ontario government announced the closure of the now former Office of the Ontario Child Advocate. CCWS began as a question: what do we do next? But also, how do we make a break from the child welfare cycle where the same conversations, the same experts, the same conferences, and the same organizations keep themselves on repeat? At what point do we as child welfare survivors divest from the rampant saviorism, opportunism, and tokenism throughout this sector and in all of the organizations we took up space in? As the child welfare experts, advocates, lawyers, and judges have called us, what can we as the maladjusted problem with authority asks too many questions youth imagine? As I've said before, at what point do we go from topic and evidence for others to architects for ourselves? It's these questions that myself and my colleagues Ashley Ash and Tyler Dixon attempt to answer through CCWS since we began this work in November of 2018. It's for this reason that we are also trying to ask different questions tonight about child welfare and abolition, rather than the repeat the kinds of conversations we already have about this, about child welfare, such as issues of overrepresentation. We are thankful for the support from the Black Legal Action Center, who is our organizational mentor in this endeavor, as well as the Ontario Trillium Fund through the Youth Opportunity Fund. Some kind of housekeeping items. I also want to direct some attention to our announcement that our individual advocacy program is now up and running. That is a program that supports primarily our mandate, which is Black, Indigenous, and racialized child welfare survivors between the ages of 12 to 25 dealing with child protection. So if you or you know someone who fits within that range and they need support with some child welfare related matter, or as a child welfare survivor, another experience such as an education or in the criminal punishment system or psychiatric systems, please direct them to us. However, we also have tried to break away from this idea that child protection should only focus on the child. So we also provide support to families and caregivers having to navigate child protection investigations and child protection service provision, if that's what they call it. And so we just launched this 2 weeks ago. So if you work in an organization, you're able to refer to us. If you need support, go to our website. It's under the individual advocacy tab. It explains our service areas. It explains how to do the intake. Frankly, the intake is actually emailing myself or calling the number, which is the work phone for the intake. And then I already talked about the chat. And so now I'm going to introduce our wonderful moderator for tonight. Elle Jones is a poet, journalist, professor, and activist living in Halifax, Nova Scotia. She was the 5th Poet Laureate of Halifax and a 2015 resident of the International Writing Program at University of Iowa. Elle was the poet in residence at the University of Toronto Scarborough in 2021. She won 2 Atlantic Journalism Gold Awards in 2018 and in 2019. In 2016, Elle was a recipient of the Burnley Rocky Jones Human Rights Award for her work with prisoners. She was the 15th Nancy's Chair in Women's Studies at Mount Saint Vincent University. Elle received her PhD in Cultural Studies at Queen's University and is an assistant professor in the Department of Political and Canadian Studies at Mount Saint Vincent University. She recently was the chair of the subcommittee that released the report, Defunding the Police in HRM. Thank you, Elle, and welcome.
Thank you so much, Josh. And it's really beautiful tonight to see 300 people sign up for this event. I'm so proud of you for this. It's wonderful to be here. Of course, that bio didn't really say anything about why I'm here. I just gave you my generic bio. So perhaps I should say just very briefly, I've watched Josh and worked with Josh as part of the team that was working with Abdul and Fatuma. So these issues are dear to my heart, but of course I am not somebody myself who is a survivor of child welfare. So it's very important tonight. People often call events historic, but I think this event really is historic to have an event that's actually organized by people who are the direct survivors of the child welfare system. Often when we speak about abolition and policing, we either ignore the child welfare system entirely, or we simply just glance at it and say, and also child welfare and these other sites, without really going into what that means. So tonight we are going to be speaking specifically about the child welfare system. And we're going to be hearing from people involved in that system, either as survivors or people who have worked with those within the system to challenge that system in particular, and to really reveal to us the violences that are embedded deep within this system, from settler colonialism, from imperialism, from racism, from homophobia and transphobia, and we will hear about that tonight. So I'm not going to speak too long in this intro. I should say I am also speaking to you from Jabuktuk Mi'kma'ki, the ancestral, unsurrendered, and ongoing territories of the Mi'kmaq people. So with that said, I'm going to read some bios, just a little bit of housekeeping. So as Josh said, please do use the chat to ask questions and be mindful, as he said, around who might read the information in those questions. We will be collecting those and trying to answer as best and as many we can at the end of the event. We're going to have 3 questions that we're going to do to this panel tonight. People will answer for about 5 minutes, and then after that we will have a Q&A period, just so you know where we're going. I know I speak a bit quickly. I'm going to try and slow down for those who need accessibility, and the captions are on, so please, hopefully that is helpful to people who need accessibility. If there are any other needs, you can put them in the chat, and hopefully we can do something to meet those accessibility needs. If not, We are very deeply sorry. Issues of disability completely intersect with what we're speaking about. And we know that many of these spaces are very ableist and not built for everyone's needs. So if you do have needs and you want to address it for further events, please also do let us know. Without going on further, I'm going to read the bios of who you're hearing tonight. So Josie Pickens, who goes by she, her pronouns, is an educator, a journalist, and a community organizer. She currently serves as the program director of Upend Movement, an organization whose mission is to build towards the abolition of the child welfare system, which is more accurately described as the family policing system. In addition to her organizing work, she regularly provides timely social, cultural, and political commentary for Ebony, Essence, Bitch, Mike News, The Root, Cassius, and more. Her thoughts have been shared on the New York Times, the Washington Post, and the Guardian news sites. And you can connect with her on Twitter at Joe Nubian, sorry, Jonubian, Joe Nubian. So that is Josie Pickens. Next, we have Elizabeth Julian Wilson, who also goes by she, her pronouns. She's been working as a family lawyer since 1995. She has practiced at all levels of court in Ontario with a particular focus on child protection. Elizabeth recognizes that the impact of a fractured family, whether through separation or divorce, or the involvement of child protection agencies, and how this fracturing creates waves over generations. Her work is particularly notable in the context of the Mother Risk Commission, as she was the lawyer to discover the faulty hair follicle tests when representing her client. And very briefly, if people aren't familiar with that, essentially people were being tested and found you're criminalized for drug use, and it turned out it was hairspray, hair gel, all kinds of other things that led to so many families being separated and people being criminalized as a result. So just very briefly, you might hear more about that, but just to orient you in that. And finally, Josh Lamers, he, him. Josh is a Black, queer, disabled, mad child welfare survivor. He's currently the executive lead of the collective of child welfare survivors with the Black Legal Action Center as their organizational mentor. Josh's community and academic work centers the intersections of Blackness, disability and madness, child welfare survivorship, queerness, and transness. Josh's graduate research titled From Topic and Evidence to Architect: The Development of Black Diasporic Interpretive Phenomenology and the Resistive Strategies of Black Child Welfare Survivors received the Graduate Writers Award and will be published in the forthcoming book, Child Welfare and the Myth of Protection. And I believe only a couple of days ago, Josh received his acceptance into the PhD in law, is that correct? University of Toronto. So he ups to Josh for that. Big congratulations, so proud of you. So with that said, we're going to move to the question period. As I said, do use the chat, go ahead and put, as you go through the night, put what you need to put in the chat. That is being monitored, so please engage. All right, so for the first question, I'm going to try and read this slowly so people have a sense of it. In the area of child welfare, there are various ways to describe the system and those who interact with the system. For example, child welfare, or child protection, or child and family services, or youth in care. There's also certain times the system uses the language of voluntariness, such as parents voluntarily agreeing to child protection service provision. What problems and concerns do you have with this kind of language, especially when it comes to the experiences of Black, Indigenous, and racialized folks? And what language do you use to better describe the system and those who interact with it? Josh, you're on screen, so I'm going to start with you, and then we'll move. You don't want to start?
Right, we're
going to go in order. Yeah. Okay, Josie, if you would like to go first. All right, sorry, I was interrupting the system. Josie, if you would like to start with that question, go ahead.
No problem. Where do I begin? Like this kind of language is problematic for so many reasons, but first of all, because it portrays the family policing system as a legitimate, supportive, helpful system, right? One that supports the safety and well-being of children through necessary interventions. But when we look at the child welfare system historically, and even in its current model and current reality, we know that statistics say otherwise. It has and continues to function to maintain anti-Blackness, settler colonialism, and in general, white heteropatriarchy. So when we use phrases, for instance, like youth in care, we don't also speak about some alarming statistics. For instance, here in the US, 50% of Black children and families in the US will be investigated by the child welfare system. That's 1 in 2 children. Black mothers' bodies are often surveilled and policed before they even give birth through like drug testing and other means. Black and Indigenous children are way more likely to be separated from their families, thrown into foster care systems, where they may very well experience more harm than they experience in their actual familial units. And so when we say youth in care, it just doesn't add up to what is actually happening in the system. And when we speak to survivors, right? And when we speak to families who have had to navigate this system, we know that most youth or former youth impacted by this system would prefer or would have preferred to stay within their families. We find that most families are separated because of these loose definitions of neglect, not because of harm, not because of abuse in the ways that we are made to believe. And this neglect that is defined by the system is usually more closely related to scarcity issues, housing scarcity, food scarcity, and so forth. So if we're saying that this is a system of care, then if that were true, we would really be focusing on these types of societal issues, right? The system does not seek to end any poverty, scarcity issues that we face as a society. We see a system that pays into a foster home or foster care facility, but will not provide access to funding for families that are struggling. It is a system that is rooted in surveillance, in punishment, in regulation. And if we really cared about families, if we really cared about youth, then that just would not be the orientation of the system.
I was on mute, rookie mistake. I said, thank you so much. And I apologize because I know I went out of order for that question. So sorry if you're expecting to go second. And I want to just comment before we move to the next speaker, Elizabeth, that it's also really interesting to hear these cross-border connections and how this anti-Blackness, this history of family separation, these legacies take place across borders and globally, in fact, as well. So thank you for that perspective. Elizabeth, I'm going to ask you next if you'd like to give your answer.
I was also on mute. How do you add to what was just said? One of the issues as a practicing lawyer in the area for about 27 plus years is the fact that the legislation in Ontario, the Child, Youth and Family Services Act, in and of itself says that the paramount purpose is the best interest of the children. And there are a number of other purposes which, when read generously, are really meant to build families or rebuild families, not to break down families. The problem with the legislation is that its purpose doesn't match the functions and the enormous power that is then given to societies. They are not at all aligned. So societies have almost no discretion in terms of how to marry their service and their function to the building of families, the recognition of race, the recognition of culture, the dictate to try and provide resources that are supposed to build families up. When we live in a world that has existed as long as this one has, where laws were first created to treat everyone as property. We have not moved forward. The statistics that Josie just mentioned, since I've been practicing, those statistics have existed and the needle hasn't moved. But every discussion around child welfare or child protection or child services is around the statistics. So all of the time and energy is spent on what has been done instead of becoming creative with what can be done. So the labeling of child welfare and child protection really in and of itself does not meet what the law was established to do. Societies then create policies on the back of the legislation that continue to have systemic barriers built into the policies because they view it, as Josie said, as policing, as opposed to building or rebuilding or assisting in building. So we have a misnomer to begin with. And then we have the guardians of the legislation working in ways that are not at all meant to honor the purpose or use the resources that are provided to them to build. I'll just mention very quickly the mother risk. I'm not quite sure that it had, as Josh would say, as much to do with me. But what came out of the trial that I did was quite horrifying in terms of having someone from an agency so embedded with the societies that could casually say in a trial that the test that we use was created for white males who drink beer. And in the years that it's been created, we have not done anything to modernize it, to move it forward, to be considerate of the numbers of people that we are testing that do not belong to that demographic, that essentially we had no interest in doing it. No one has considered doing it. And we will continue running tests that don't match the people that we serve. And that is the problem when I look at the language. I can only speak for me, but when I look at the language, it's a perpetuation of descriptions of people as property. It is a perpetuation of very narrow thinking. It is a perpetuation of all of the players within the system not moving the needle, and that includes lawyers, not challenging enough, not judges, not learning enough about the people who are coming to them for assistance. That's how I have always looked at the language. That's how I've always tried to work within the system in trying to ensure that we move away as far as possible from that kind of description. And at least for my clients, try to make sure that their humanness is front and center so that decisions made about them can focus on that.
Thank you so much. And I have to say, I had absolutely never made the connection between property and like the breaking up of families and this notion of protectionism, that very colonial and paternal idea of child protection connected to property. And you actually just blew my mind a little with that. So thank you for sharing that. And I'm just going to remind us of the question as we move to Josh. So we're speaking about the euphemisms used within the system, such as care or welfare or protection, and how that language serves to kind of obscure what is going on and the experiences that people actually have. So go ahead, Josh.
Yeah, so I'm not like, what I'll say is kind of in place of these kind of youth in care or the youth in care language. That's actually why we use the term child welfare survivor for our collective, because it forces folks to direct a certain level of attention to the idea that you are surviving something, and And it just so happens we're not talking about the family you were taken from. And so that was an important change that we made. And in some ways we've had to explain that, because I think the ways in which child welfare was developed, which was through white femininity. And so this like kind of white feminine benevolence and care, all this language is actually to protect and maintain that white femininity, the way in which gender is functioning. And so, you know, we see that in some of the language shifts that happen within the law. So now that rather than saying apprehension, they say bringing to a place of safety. And so they're trying to once again further obscure the kinds of violences that happen, and also try to direct attention away from the fact that, you know, as we've talked about, statistically speaking, very few of us are better off once we enter and leave. Another term that we reckon with and change language around is the term transracial adoption. We don't use the term transracial, we use the term racial displacement through adoption. And the reason for that is, for us, the term transracial is a suggestion that's always impossible. When the racialized other is put largely into the white home, that's largely the reality, statistically speaking. When the racialized other is put in that house, you know, if you're the racialized other and you're the problem, it's you who's removed, right? If there's certain things that happen, it's you that's going to pay the impact. It's you that's going to feel the isolation. Likely you have been put in an area where you are one of few racialized people. And so this idea that you have home in that setting, that you've crossed, so you are transracial, is that you have crossed into that setting, is always, it's an incomplete promise. Because, you know, even as the reality for some folks who have been racially displaced through adoption, the reality that when you're an adult, you start to realize exactly what your childhood was and the role you played and the kind of desires that you were meant to be a vessel of. And so by using the term transracial displacement, we are making people be honest about what's happening here. And I know that for some folks, it makes you start to ask questions around, you know, interracial relationships and what happens within those households. And I don't think our naming of racial displacement means our questions don't attach to that. Those are fundamental questions about what's operating in a household when we're talking about whiteness, anti-Blackness, anti-Indigenous racism. Because again, when you look at the statistics, not the statistics, but the histories of Indigenous children and youth being violated, harmed, killed, same thing with Black children and youth who have been adopted. You know, for folks who might know what this is, I know one of them's name is Sarah Hunt. I can't remember the other one, but there was a family who adopted, I think it was like 6 Black kids. There's the kind of famous image of this Black kid crying while a police officer goes up to hug him. Well, the white women who were queer, who adopted these kids, then did a murder-suicide with all of the kids. And so again, like these operating histories of violence and adoption. And so that's why we try to direct attention to that violence. Yeah, Sarah and Jennifer Hunt. Hart, yes, Hart.
Thank you so much, Josh. And what's emerged from that first set of questions and answers as well is how much the child welfare system is interacting with other criminalized systems as well. Many of us who work in the prison system come into contact with the child welfare system through seeing that residual effect of people. And the other thing I just want to draw attention to is in all the comments we saw, we often think of home as a perhaps place away from the things we experience on the street. I can go home and hopefully be safe from policing. But of course, a child welfare system, part of what is so intimate about its violence is it's coming into the heart of families, into homes, as Josh talked about, literally creating others within households. I love that language you used of crossing. So invoking the language of like the passage and the trade and migration, all these things that have belonged to us as people of the African diaspora being forced upon us, and that is actually being enacted in households. So thank you everybody for those answers. And Josie, I'm sorry, you're gonna have to go first twice because I'm trying to stick us back into the agenda. So I apologize. We're going to move to the next question. So the questions are also in the chat, so you can follow along. So in this question, we're speaking about the family punishment system notoriously targets Black, Indigenous, and racialized women and femme folks. At the same time, child welfare survivors within the system experience certain kinds of violences related to gender. In what ways do you see gender as a system and worldview operate within the family punishment system? And Josie, you're batting lead off again. I'm sorry.
I'm back at it. Okay. I was recently reading this report from the UN, and it talked about like gender dimensions and child protection. And there's one quote that I actually want to read that I think really gets to the root of this question, and then I'll expand. It says, the patriarchal family structure creates an environment that normalizes many forms of violence, simultaneously infantilizing women and reinforcing their subordination alongside children. And so when we're talking about social norms, right? We have to think about restrictive social norms and how we define families, how we define identities, including gender and sexual identities, right? And also how those definitions contribute to what we're seeing in the system, particularly when we're talking about LGBTQIA+ youth. We also know that if these youth are removed from their homes, they will likely face great harm in a foster system that also subscribes to these social norms and these antiquated and patriarchal definitions of what family is and what gender is, the binaries that exist in that, and so forth. These ideas about gender and sexuality, which leads to so much harm for queer youth. I live in Houston, Texas, and I believe most people who are here in this panel are familiar with what is happening in Texas with Governor Greg Abbott's decision to target trans youth and their families by ordering state child welfare agencies to surveil and punish parents whose children are receiving gender-affirming health care. Not only has he threatened families, you know, the families, the parents of trans youth, but he also is threatening professionals, any type of medical professionals, anyone who is considered a first reporter, who fails to report those parents for criminal prosecution. And so we're fighting tooth and nail here in the state of Texas against that, and really throughout the US. Because of course we know that gender affirming healthcare is a matter of life and death for trans children. And this is a reality that is supported through all kinds of statistics that are found in medical associations and from medical practitioners. Queer folks and those advocating for us, of course, are outraged by these developments, but this kind of surveillance and punishment is nothing new to those of us who study the child welfare system and who are looking to abolish it. And I think this is a real moment for folks who are marginalized for all kinds of reasons to really bring that focus back to how Black and Indigenous youth particularly are treated in the system. Now, this isn't a conversation about oppression Olympics, what is happening to trans youth, what is happening to queer youth and queer folk, particularly in these red states and these Republican states here in the US, absolutely is outrageous. It needs to be documented. But I think this is also a moment where there are some people who have never had to think about the child welfare system, the family policing system, and how people have to maneuver through the system, who are now kind of taking notice of what surveillance looks like, or what regulation looks like, what punishment looks like, when you are just simply trying to do your best to survive and help your children to survive. I'll share again that, you know, this fear is a constant reality for so many Black and Indigenous families. And I am hoping that because we are paying such close attention to what is happening in Texas and what is happening throughout, as I said, the red states in the US, with respect to what LGBTQIA+ youth are experiencing, will help us to realize how easy it is to come in contact with the system, how easy it is to have a difficult time escaping the system, how easy it is to be penalized, and how it hurts and harms youth and families. So those are my thoughts about gender and sexuality, and how those children are affected by the system, and even broader, how more children are affected by the system, and hoping that we can pay attention to all of that as we move forward to dismantle this system altogether.
Thank you so much, Josie. And we have a request. Can we get the name of the report? And I will look it up and put it into the chat, but people were asking about the report that you shared, and we can get a link.
Let's see.
I can find it for you, but okay. You're gonna look, okay. And thank you.
Yes,
so
it was
much.
a UN report. I think if you Google UN report, gender child protection, it should.
Okay, we will find it. You don't have to find it. But thank you for that. And thank you also, of course, for raising what is happening in Texas right now. As you said, many of us are familiar with that, but drawing that connection between the particular kinds of policing and state violence as well. So thank you. Josh, I'm going to turn to you, and we're speaking about gender within the child welfare system and the policing and criminalizing and other notions of that. So go ahead, Josh.
Okay, so, you know, kind of an attachment to what I just said earlier around like how white femininity operates as a gender system, and how that collides with parents in particular as to how they're surveilled. Like, folks, I think it's important that folks remember that there's histories as to how gender functioned for Black and Indigenous and racialized folks. For Black folks, you know, when we were brought onto the slave ship, we were ungendered and made into property through this system of gender. So that's not to say gender never touched us. It's like, this is how gender operated for us. And that, I think, and that attaches to what Elizabeth is saying around notions of property and how children and you know, arguably and technically mothers and families, Black families, are still property to the state because of the ways in which it's able to act. You know, for Indigenous folks, the way in which the residential school system functioned, the 60s scoop, it was significantly about gender and the ways in which children were being assigned a gender and put in a particular space and made to do certain activities, which erased the various ways in which Indigenous peoples experience what we call gender, in terms of notions of femininity, masculinity, beyond that, within that, as to how we articulate it now. And that's still playing out to today. Like, when I was kind of like processing this question, I was like, you know, what the slave ship is to the slave is what the car is to a child welfare survivor that is Black. Because entering that car, you have no idea where you're going. You don't know how you're going to be gendered going in. And if you are someone who doesn't fit comfortably within those notions of gender, you are probably experiencing violence on the way and on intake, or when you enter that space. You know, one of the things that when we were kind of having our panel prep and talking with one another, like, I can't indicate a specific space for trans youth. I can't indicate particular practices that are within this system to be a safe space for trans and gender nonconforming, non-binary children and youth. And so that, for me, I'm not asking that this carceral and violent system now be more inclusive. but the fact that that already isn't there shows you how gender is functioning in this system, and has a particular impact on Black and Indigenous youth. Like for Black kids who are considered a boy, you are hyper demonized, you're aged in a particular way. For Black girls, same thing. We see that with Makia Bryant, the way that she was shot and killed by police, and the way in which a lot of people in the public consider that justified, when this was a girl who was having particular kinds of conflict not in the foster home, but was at her foster home. And again, so we kind of see how property functions with gender to make her death possible. And then again, we have an entire system set up when we think about Black folks, and the fact that from history until now, we were never considered a part of these white conceptions of gender. So therefore, Black, trans, and gender nonconforming or gender nonconforming non-binary youth are put into particular level of precarity. And then, folks who know me know I don't mind naming names. Like, I have concerns about how, like, the advocate's office, former advocate's office, former Office of the Interior Child Advocate, had a report in 1998 that indicated that the other child welfare survivors were like, oh, there was a Black trans youth that was experiencing harm. And this is 1998. So that office that claimed to be for children and youth had that piece of information, and yet here we are. So kind of what Elizabeth was saying, the needle never moved. And then, same office in 2014, when it's World Pride and city was getting hella gay, the advocate's office was like, oh, we have a queer and trans youth project. And they did a bit of work. And guess what was the first project to disappear after World Pride? And so also the way in which, therefore, and when we think of overrepresentation, Black, Indigenous, and trans, Black, Indigenous, racialized, trans, gender nonconforming, non-binary children and youth are therefore made a token while still experiencing this extreme level of precarity, and then being abandoned by the very people who say we got you. And so, we're seeing how gender, like that, for me, gender still works as a system that's quite carceral, quite violent, and reproduces so many things in terms of history, and is one of those things that I think is keeping that needle staying and where it is.
Thank you, Josh. And by the way, as I was trying to search that report, which is in the chat, of course, what I got was a whole list of stuff about gendered violence in Muslim homes. So it was like, child protection in Syrian homes, like violence against women and children. So it's just interesting in the search terms as well. That itself shows who is assumed to be doing violence to women and children, who is assumed to have domestic violence, and the homes that are assumed to be safe and protective, which are white homes. So thank you for sharing that link, Josie, because I could not find it. Finally, Elizabeth, so we are speaking here about gender. Go ahead, Elizabeth.
One of the things that I have sort of observed over the years and have a real aversion to is labels. Because for me, historically, just as laws were rooted in property, historically, labels are meant to divide, are meant to keep separate, are meant to ensure different types of treatment. Historically, that's how they came about. Going back to the law again, for me, the law is not static. It is not written and left alone. It has to evolve. It is dynamic, and it has to evolve as we evolve. That doesn't happen because one of the things that Josh was saying at the time that stuck with me is the change of names. We look at changing labels in order to fix things. So now, as Josh said, in our legislation, instead of apprehension, we have moved to a place of safety. That label is exactly the same as apprehension, because the assumption is where you are being moved from was not safe. Where you're being moved to is safe. And we therefore can do that to you, for you, and on your behalf. So in terms of this particular question, I'm trying to think of the right words. Societies, as far as I'm concerned, based on the legislation, when they develop their policy out of the legislation, for me, they should be looking at the person in front of them and creating spaces for the people in front of them as they identify. But that can't happen in this area. It can't happen in the environment that we're in, because the first response from a society with respect to where are you placing my child, does that space accommodate my particular child? The first response is that we don't have the resources, we don't have the foster homes who will be able to take this specific child. So we really have nowhere to put them. And if they are mindful of the families that they're helping, of the call from the legislation itself to pay attention to race, sexual orientation, culture, attachment to family, relationship with family, bond with family, cultural background, if they are mindful of all of those things listed, all of those particular labels, then surely their job would be to ensure that in developing a foster home roster, that it caters to all of the things that are listed. But it's easier, I'm guessing, because I've looked at it for 27 years, going into court for 27 years, hearing the same refrain. We cannot accommodate. We don't have enough Muslim foster parents. We can't find a home where this particular child can attend this particular church service, because we don't have the people. But you keep creating foster homes, and you keep creating people, and you keep developing resources to meet your mandate, to meet your function. But because we continue to exist in spaces where there is systemic discrimination, where there are systemic obstacles, there is an almost unwillingness to look beyond where you are and come up with, I would like to say, creative solutions, but it's not creative. It's simply looking at who you are supposed to serve and serving them well. So it's not creative. What I would hope, and I have to congratulate Josh for being able to do his PhD. I hope that the people who have this experience in this arena are the ones who will speak. I hope that the law students, because it begins with the law, as Josie said, in Texas, they are trying to do legislation, right? It begins with making sure that there is representation in the writing of the laws, the enactment of the laws, and then using the word policing that legislation to ensure that the policies that are coming out of that legislation are not written to continue to develop systemic barriers, because that's where the systemic barriers come. It is an area that is so very close to my heart, because as I said, I've been practicing this for a long time, and trial upon trial in child protection cases, it is the same information. There is the same reliance on, we have, let's call it 40 foster homes, but we don't have any foster home that can accommodate this or that, or religion or culture or anything else. And my question is always, but isn't that your job? To develop these resources to meet the needs of the people that you're serving as described in the legislation under which you are acting.
Thank you.
I don't know if that answers the question, but
no, that was wonderful. And one of the connections I was making as you were speaking is between this idea of extracting children and the broader like extractive industries that also run our economy. So the same logic of scarcity is then applied into families as well. So thank you. I'm going to try and speed up a little bit. We are running behind, as Josh said. We started a bit late. This is our final question. So I see people with your wonderful comments in the chat. If you want to start putting questions in there as well, we do have time for some Q&A. And we do ask, we did say this was an hour, but we started a bit late and it's such a rich topic. So we'll keep you not more than another half hour if you want to hang with us. The final question is, when we talk about abolition in child welfare, what does it look like to you to live in a world without this family punishment system? What work are you currently doing or have done to bring us towards this vision? So speaking about abolition and child welfare, and Josh, you are first.
So I actually want to loop back almost to some of the stuff that's coming out that Elizabeth's saying. I don't think there's anything wrong with saying creativity, because the reality is, you know, white supremacy, anti-Blackness was an imagination that was then enacted. And so much of Black, Indigenous, racialized, queer, trans, so much scholarship talks about imagining otherwise, a radical imagination. And I think, you know, in the setting of law students and I, we don't really get along because, frankly, I would argue most of them lack that, an imagination. And Joy James, it was like a panel she was speaking on. Joy James is a Black feminist scholar and writer. I can't remember where she teaches out of, but she said this thing around like essentially that like pragmatism is such a sad endeavor, like to think that you need to be pragmatic, and that like nothing that has happened in concert that we consider revolutionary, like it required imagination, it required creativity. And so, you know, a world without the family, you know, policing punishment system, for me, is a world where, you know, families and communities aren't experiencing these ruptures and fractures. Like, I'm not saying that there aren't going to be issues within a family setting, but that issue isn't necessarily understood in its nuclear family, that it happens in the context of community, and that there is resources for community to attend to it without a child being completely removed. That there's a reason, like the reality is yeah, but from what I'm hearing from folks that I know, parents need a break from their kids, but also kids need a break from their parents. And that doesn't just look like school. And so how do we set up certain structures that support that without being like, well, now you're a bad parent because you need space from your kid? You know, a lot of us throughout this pandemic have been like, to be a parent in the pandemic is a particularity that, you know, I actually can't imagine. And so how do we set up societies and spaces and communities like that? And I would argue that would, you know, that leads into other questions of abolition and the abolition of the legal system, because it's functioning exactly how it was made to function. You know, the abolition of policing systems, such as the criminal punishment system, such as psychiatric systems, OW, ODSP, all of these things need to go, and we need to better resource ourselves. And so, you know, I don't think that CCWS is not an abolitionist organization. We can't be. We're funded by the government. We have responsibilities to the government. But in that, we are trying to be as transparent as possible about what that looks like for us. You can go on our website. We've put how much money we get. We've put the conditions around how we get that money, because we're not like other people who take lots of money and don't do that. And, you know, we consider ourselves harm reduction. And I think that's kind of, you know, the work that I'm doing now, between beefing with law students and the rest of my daily life. Like, this is harm reduction for us. We're trying to build a harm reduction model that hopefully brings us along to abolition, that brings us toward that vision. And in some ways, we've been successful. We've been able to divert families away from child protection investigations. We've been able to put the spotlight in certain moments on the child protection worker. I've made quite a few. I shouldn't say quite a few. I've made some child protection workers, and this is an attachment to white femininity, cry, because they didn't realize that they're realizing that they can't get away with the ways in which they're treating Black, Indigenous, and racialized parents, particularly mothers, the ones that I've worked with. So, you know, that's the kind of work I'm doing with that vision, that we're doing with that. We're partnering with people we actually trust, hence End Movement being here, and Josie, hence Elizabeth being here. You know, being honest about our experiences, frankly, about who we've interacted with, what those interactions have been in the past, you know, and also having moments of conflict with our partners, not even conflict, but moments of tension with our community partners, where we make sure that they really understand what it means to work with child welfare survivors, which is why on our website, if you go to the resources, there's protocols that we've made of what to do when working with child welfare survivors around media, around, you know, putting us in leadership positions and then giving us a $20 honorarium. You know, those kinds of moments we've tried to attend to. So again, it really has been about harm reduction. And it's also, you know, we started off with shutting down Queen and Bay at 8 a.m. To commemorate the 12 young people who died directly in child welfare that year, to also organize against the closure of the advocate's office, again, acknowledging the contentions within it. That for us was a part of that vision. And it was really interesting. You know, it was white women yelling at us, telling us to move, and it was construction workers coming down and telling them to get out of our way. And so you kind of really see this interesting dynamic around class in the way in which we organize. So I think that's another important aspect, is we're trying to conduct ourselves in a way in which resonates with community, rather than folks seeing us as a, you know, 20th floor office and they don't really know how to talk to us.
Thank you, Josh. And beefing with law students is also an abolitionist act. Elizabeth, go ahead.
What I am hoping to see is, I'm going to use Josh's term, radical imagination, as opposed to creativity. And it is something that can happen in a courtroom. It is something that can happen within a legal setting. But for some reason, lawyers, judges, the courtroom setting, immediately you think that you cannot have imagination. And when you are dealing with laws that appear to be so rigid, you don't allow yourself the opportunity to really look at what is being said and use the words that are being said to move forward, because you approach it with rigidity. I am hoping that I can encourage law students to have imagination, to understand that what is written is really what you need to pay attention to, and marry it with the client that you have. I hope that I've done that in the 27 years that I've practiced. One of the things that I felt I was compelled to do at the very beginning, when I had clients dealing with the CAS, is to ensure that their responses spoke about who they were, as opposed to responses that simply responded to the allegations about them. And it puzzled me that a case after case after case, if you sat in a courtroom, the only information you got about the person dealing with the Children's Aid Society was their response, their defending of the allegations that were made about them. But you had no sense of who that person was or how they came to be there. And over the years, you understood that there was so much miscommunication, so much misinformation, so much time spent simply responding to allegations, when you were in a position as a lawyer or a judge to really ensure that that family had resources, to really ensure that that child did not have to bear the pain of a long-term separation. Here in Ontario, if a child is brought into care and you get into court, the parents have 5 days in which to respond. More often than not, they're getting the document with the allegations against them the night before or the day of. they don't have a lot of time. So by the time they find a lawyer, a child might be in foster care for 3 months, 4 months, only to go back to find, for instance, in one instance, the grandmother said, "These children are killing me." She was from the Caribbean. The children were not killing her. That is an expression that my grandmother used. "You guys are killing me," right? Those kids spent time in foster care because nobody took the time to figure out really what is she saying. So radical imagination, ensuring that the people who have the responsibility for these clients use their imagination, understand what they're working with, be prepared to use what they're working with, be prepared to stand up to the society, to stand up to judges, to say, "Wait a minute, you are not listening." Be prepared to ensure that when you present information, that you are letting the judge and the society know who this person is, instead of spending all your time. The neighbor saw the child barefoot in the street, and the parents saying, "No, it wasn't barefoot, it was 10 minutes. When no one has any idea of how that came to be. So be imaginative and pay attention to the person in front of you in order to get away from this idea that there is only one way to do this, which is to simply repeat what you're being told. So what I would like to see is a lot more radical imagination walking into courtrooms in child welfare.
Thank you so much. So we have this beautiful theme of not being afraid to be radical, of confronting systems, and of the imagination. And go ahead, Josie, as well, to finish off this section.
Okay, I'm closing it out this time.
You are.
When people ask me about my vision as an abolitionist, and to be clear, I feel that there isn't a system that doesn't need abolition work, that doesn't need to be dismantled, whether we're talking about the prison industrial complex, child welfare, housing systems, mental health care systems. Like, all of these systems are interconnected. All of them involve the same type of surveillance, regulation, and punishment and violence. But when I think about abolition and like who I am as an abolitionist and the work that I want to continue to do, I always think of this quote from the great abolitionist thinker, Ruth Wilson Gilmore, who is a prison industrial complex abolitionist. She says that abolition is about presence, not absence. It's about building life-affirming institutions. And I think so often people are so afraid of abolition because they only think of abolition in the limited imaginative way of dismantling, tearing down, right? Which is, to be clear, an important part of the abolition conversation. But I think if most of us interrogate and investigate ourselves, many of us, if we're doing any type of social justice work, if we're doing any type of community work, we are doing abolition work. I have been a community organizer for over 20 years now. And when I think about the work that I have been doing, it has been trying to build sustainable communities. So for me, the road towards abolition requires us to upend many of the societal issues. You know, when we're talking about racism, when we're talking about poverty, we can begin helping families stay together by ensuring that everyone's basic needs are met in society. That's number one. And that in itself, as Josh has been saying, and as Elizabeth has said, requires radical imagination, because it's not something that we have ever seemed to be able to do. Abolition also looks like continuing to build, as I said, sustainable communities so that families can find the help and the resources that they need within communities and do not have to rely on these archaic, decaying, failing systems to help them. I think Josh brought up earlier the case of Ma'Khia Bryant that has been on my heart. I think it was just yesterday or the day before, the police officer who murdered her was not charged or didn't face any charges for her murder. And I think about how Ma'Khia Bryant was failed by so many people in the child welfare system. I think about how, her mother was trying to get help for her, how her grandmother was trying to take care of her and there were no resources available to help her. And the only thing that I kept thinking as I read through all of those reports surrounding her death was, what if there was community intervention? What if there was community care for Ma'Khia and her family? And so we need to build communities to kind of solve the problems that families face, right? And to be resources for families. I think that abolition looks like work towards transformative justice. It looks like figuring out how to break away from our own carceral logic, the way that we think about the innocents and the bad people, and how we need the government to come in and intervene and save the innocents from the bad people. Abolition involves us taking the reins and making decisions to strengthen families and strengthen communities. And that can look like everything from parenting classes at a community center to mutual aid work, all things that I've been involved in. This looks like a million tiny experiments. I was speaking to a friend of mine, Jason Oliver, yesterday about Miriam Kaba and Project Nia. Miriam Kaba is also a prison industrial complex abolitionist. You all should look that up, 1 million experiments. But basically, it is this idea that we are trying to fight against a system that has been in place for more than a century, and so we aren't going to have the answers to how to fix this or to create something new overnight. What it requires is, as everyone is saying, radical imagination and experimentation and room and resources to experiment, to figure out what can work for communities and for families. That's just a little bit. I know we're running out of time, so I'm going to stop there.
Thank you so much. And that was a beautiful ending from everybody. We have about 15 minutes for questions. Very quickly, I'm going to scroll up and read a couple of comments in the chat, just because I just don't want to ignore some of the engagements, but sorry, I have to scroll a bit. So I'm not going to read names just in case, well, I guess it's public. So Tiffany said, Indigenous child welfare in Toronto is inflicting great harm to our community. We need advocacy to stand up to the oppressive and harmful effects of Toronto Native Child and Family Services of Toronto. This harm continues to affect Afro-Indigenous and Indigenous children. Our community needs your help. So just that comment I think is important. And then Sydney made a comment about transformative justice solutions. Systems we design should not cause harm that is preventable. They should always evolve to meet the needs of those they serve and get to the root of harm to eliminate it. Unfortunately, the systems we live in today were designed specifically to cause and replicate harm to legitimate itself. And that's where creativity and collective imagination come in. So some wonderful engagements in the chat. Very quickly, I am going to move to questions. Thank you everybody for sharing and engaging, and thank you so much to our panelists. We're going to try and rapid fire this a little bit so we can get through these questions. So the first question is from Michelle Almedia. I hope I'm saying that correctly. Michelle Almedia. As a clinical supervisor of a program funded by my county's DHS, I struggle to promote client-centered care while balancing mandates by the funder that feel very much like policing of families. Any insights on how to push back against the harm the system asks us to perpetuate in families, or how to talk about it with families to empower them? So I don't know if anyone wants to answer that. So pushing back against the mandates put upon you by funders or other government agencies, and how do you push back on that or talk with families in order to empower them? Anyone can take that.
I always go back to the legislation, because the funding for children's aid societies comes from the legislation, and it is supposed to match the purpose of the legislation. So to me, the pushback is always the policy is written by the society, the legislation is the director. The pushback is always, we are to meet the mandate under this legislation, not the policy created by the society. Because as Josie said, it's a million experiments. There really isn't any reason why the resources that are given under the legislation cannot be used for a million little experiments in terms of ensuring that families in communities have the resources that are needed. There isn't any reason why that cannot be. So to me, the pushback is always go back to what we're getting money for and who we're supposed to serve. And this is the way that it should be done.
Thank you.
It takes a lot of work.
Josh, you want to take that as well?
Yeah, I'll say it really quickly. You know, having a social work background, it comes up often, like, are you an agent of change? Are you an agent of the state? And it's kind of like, you know, students seem to struggle with grappling that it's unfortunately of both. And I think it just is about self-monitoring. Like, if you know a system is a policing system, self-monitoring the aspects of which you have to engage with and what that looks like and how do you still reduce harm in that. But often, especially with law school, all these law students were like, well, where are you gonna go if, you know, you're XYZ? And I've said that, like, I treat anything with a certain level of ambivalence, right? So as a student, I treat a program with a certain level of ambivalence because I'm not going to let it take away my life. As a social worker, when I was that, same thing, because, you know, at the end of the day, when you're pushing back, you have to ask yourself at what point, like, where is your boundary? Where is your line? And I acknowledge that certain people, if you're supporting families, if you have a family member you have to support, various kinds of precarity, you can't just exit. Like, I do say I kind of in some ways have that privilege. I have me, myself, and I to look after, therefore I can make that kind of decision. And so I think being honest about those things helps you then move through your workplace rather than being kind of ad hoc and be like, oh, that kind of felt weird. And again, as I said, knowing that, like, you are technically never permanent there. You know, your organization can very quickly change their policies and funding and suddenly lose your position. So that's why I say have a certain level of ambivalence.
Thank you. The next question is, seeing how systems of punishment and displacement, such as the family punitive system, criminal punitive system, etc., work to legitimize each other as necessary in a culture of domination, surveillance, and punishment, what are the places and beginnings to unify the abolition of these structures within our daily lives and in the systems and structures we live in? I don't know if anyone wants to take that.
I think I can start with just talking about that the same type of thinking is used to develop, perpetuate these systems. And that's what I mentioned earlier, this carceral logic, right? It's this way of thinking that is rooted in, hey, good and bad, and there must be punishment for bad. And we have certain individuals who get to choose what is good and what is bad and how we define things. I think it's also important. So when we look at it as a system of a certain way of thinking with this carceral logic, then we should be able to see how all of the systems are interconnected. I think that's the beginning. And I think it's also at the very beginning, it's us like firing the cops that live within us, right? Thinking about how we utilize carceral logic in our everyday lives, how we walk around policing people in things that we have no business doing. And once we kind of start eradicating that, those ideas in our own head, it's easier for us to see the links and to begin to do the work to work to end this type of thinking and the way that these systems operate in a more general sense and in an outward sense.
Unless anyone wants to give a quick answer, I'm going to try and get 2 more questions in. Okay, so the next question is, why do we sit here trying to fix a flawed system while some progressive cities in the States have just introduced a complete moratorium on taking children into care? They are simply not doing it anymore. Should money used for foster homes be invested in services for families? And accompanied by that is also another question about placement with families. So we have a few questions about family systems or friends rather than keeping children out of court. And should we just abolish that as well?
So I can try to rapid fire respond. So there's time for this, the last one. So in terms of the allocation of funds, like the way in which like the cost of a child in child welfare, it amounts to a significant amount that could and should be directed towards families. So yes, that should happen. In terms of, I would say that your we has to be a specific we. I don't think I'm a part of that we. I personally am not trying to fix this system. In fact, that's why CCWS has been created, because we're kind of like, y'all do you, we're gonna do us, but while you do you, we're gonna talk about you. And so I think that's kind of in relation to the radical imagination, because we're choosing to center engaging families. So, you know, we're engaging parenting groups, we're going to community centers, we're outreaching to important organizations. And I think that kind of gets to the question of like unifying. I'll say this, you know, there's a lot of anti-Blackness throughout communities. And so if you're asking that Black folks are in solidarity with you, I ask that you go do some self-work first, because as we kind of saw with the Ukraine, Black people tend to be the first people that are thrown in the line of fire or moved out of the space of quote unquote safety. But kind of what I said, to work together is kind of that model. Stop trying to, if you work for CAS, no shade, stop trying to partner with CAS, stop trying to partner with OACAS, stop trying to partner with the typical organizations. Find those who are doing the work.
I'm going to move us to the last question. And there's quite a few questions about this, around educating communities about their rights and being able to advocate, and teaching families how to advocate for themselves when confronted with the family punishment system. So perhaps each person could end with that. So what can be done, or what are we doing, or what should be done to help empower and educate communities and families?
I know at Upend, we are working to partner with organizations and organizers and build a network so that we can disseminate and share information when people contact us from all over the place. As a matter of fact, we got a note in our inbox from a mother in Canada, and I was able to refer them over to Josh and his folks. So building that network, I think, is a really important part of that conversation, because when we're building those networks, when we are making sure that we are engaging with people who are doing this work on the ground, then we know that we can refer people and give them pertinent information that is connected to where they are in the world. Because mandates, laws, and all of those things change from place to place. And that's everything from cities to states to countries. So I think that the first step in that is just, using Google, doing your research, seeking out those organizations, and simply making a list and creating a network, reaching out to those organizations to see how you can be of help, and just, building that up in order to be able to disseminate that information to families. I think that that's a great beginning.
Elizabeth, and we'll end with Josh. Go ahead, Elizabeth.
Yeah, it's the same. Partnering with organizations, having a network, a go-to that you can refer if the parents are your clients, refer parents to. Working with organizations to give information, because information is so very important. To give information to change perceptions of not just the societies, but the people that you're working with, to change perceptions, to understand what the needs are and help build resources to meet those needs.
And Josh?
So, you know, what I will say, rather than repeat other folks, there was like the notion of rights. I think, you know, we kind of see the ongoing history of where being a Black, Indigenous, or racialized person and knowing your rights and asserting your rights can actually lead to more violence. So we at CCWS are not focusing on walking into spaces and saying, know your rights, because, you know, there have been offices that have been doing that for decades, and look where we are. So if it's not working, on to the next thing. That doesn't mean we're not providing information with those we interact with, but it's not under the assumption that we've now left you, you know your rights are going to be good. And so that's our approach. So that's kind of what I'll end off with. And then maybe, like, Al, should I take, do you want me to take the reins?
Yes,
like, that's what I assume.
Close us out. I'm going to say nice things about you for 30 seconds and then close us out. So thank you everybody for coming through. I mean, it's an amazing thing to see in a first event, so many people come and engage with this. And particularly Josh, I'm so proud of you. I'm just so proud. The work that also takes to come here today, this is the result of so much work and so much organizing and people behind the scenes building community before they came out in public, doing that hard groundwork before you got on a Zoom. And I'm just really touched and honored to be here with you all tonight. And now Josh, give us our final words. Thank you so much for having me.
Oh, thank you. And thank you, Alan. Thank you, all the panelists. I can say, like, you know, like this event was kind of like one of those moments where you're like, oh my God, this is actually happening. Like, I guess we're here, we're going to be doing work. And so, you know, thank you all the attendees for coming, including those who had to leave early, and maybe you'll see this video. You know, this isn't the only thing we're going to be doing. Folks might have noticed it in the chat. We've actually have multiple things on the go. We just didn't want to flood you with information. So we do have a response to the changes around child welfare that is on our website. We're also going to be announcing positions because we're hiring. So pay attention to that. We're going to have, again, our individual advocacy program is now operating. We have our individual advocate volunteers to do that work. We're going to be doing program spaces. So look out for us, and you can go to our website, You can go to our website, collectiveofcws.ca, and if you go to the bottom and go to the subscribe, put your email, and we'll send a newsletter. And thank you again. The last thing is we're going to be sending out a survey quite shortly that asks you very basic questions. Some of it is about yourself in terms of your identity. It's completely anonymous. We just require that information for funders. And then we just want to know what you felt about the event, including if there's things that could have made it more accessible. So thank you again. I'm now going to turn the recording off. Also, I tend to do this when I say goodbye, if you haven't noticed. Have a wonderful evening, everyone. And again, thank you so much.